A sleepy town nestled between undulating hills and endless stretches of forest, Maplewood was the kind of town people rarely noticed unless it was on their way to somewhere else. The railroad had bypassed the town decades ago, and prosperity, whatever modest dreams of it there were, seemed to have left with the last passenger train. Rows of boxy, weathered homes lined the main roads. Their peeling paint and sagging porches gave silent testimony to years of hard winters and scorching summers. Yet each house bore traces of pride: flower pots with tired petunias, neatly trimmed hedges, and faded American flags fluttering in the afternoon breeze. Maplewood thrived, or rather, endured, thanks to the sprawling textile mill looming at the town's edge. The mill's tall, red brick smokestacks seemed to dominate the skyline, both a symbol of livelihoods and a mark of their limits. Most adults worked long, monotonous shifts on the factory floor, their hands calloused, their backs stooped. Job security was a myth here. Rumors of layoffs or shutdowns cast a constant pall over weekday mornings. Children grew up aware of their parents' sacrifices, their own futures glimpsed through the threadbare curtains of necessity. The air in Maplewood held a taste of machinery oil and damp earth, punctuated by the scent of fried food drifting from the lone diner on Main Street. The diner, with its flickering neon sign, was the beating heart of the town's social life. Truckers, mill workers, and retirees filled the cracked vinyl booths, their conversations a quiet hum of gossip, sports, overheard dreams, and things better left unsaid. School buses rattled along the streets, ferrying children in and out of the lives their parents had shaped, but never truly escaped. It was in one of these aging homes, at the quieter end of Willow Lane, that Emily lived with her mother, Mary, and her stepfather, Frank. Their modest, shingle-roofed house hid the marks of hardship behind a cheerful garden and a white picket fence stubbornly mended by Mary each spring. Most neighbors saw Mary in the garden early every morning, her hands gentle even as they pulled up weeds. She spoke softly to everyone, her smile quick and sincere, though her eyes often seemed far away. Emily, sharp-witted and observant even as a child, was the lone daughter of the house, too old for hopscotch, too young for escape. She had her mother's quiet resolve and, some whispered, her father's fierce intelligence. Frank, on the rare weekends he wasn't at work or the bar, often made a show of neighborliness, handing out advice, offering help with a broken fence board, lending a hand at community picnics. To outsiders, Frank was solid, a provider, a man's man with a firm handshake and a slap on the back. People liked to say, "Frank keeps his family in line," never questioning what that might mean for those behind his front door. The rhythms of Maplewood life masked deeper tensions, rumors that never quite surfaced at the church potlucks or town council meetings. Everyone in town seemed to know each other by name, at least on the surface. But there were unspoken rules about which stories got told in public and which were buried beneath the chatter. As summer turned the air heavy and slow, the town wore its sleepiness like armor. Outsiders called it quaint. Insiders called it stuck. Yet within the stillness of Maplewood, every closed door had its secrets, and every family its silent battles. For Emily, childhood was a matter of noticing things adults thought invisible. The bruises that lingered on her mother's wrists, the wary hush when Frank entered a room, the moments of awkward silence after laughter faded. But for now, all of that was hidden, cocooned within the humdrum existence of a sleepy town that prided itself on knowing everything, while truly knowing nothing at all. That summer, as dusk seeped into the narrow alleys and porch lights blinked on one by one, no one could have imagined how the routines of Maplewood and Emily's world would soon unravel. The fateful night, the night that changed everything in Maplewood, arrived with a thick, inescapable humidity clinging to the walls of the small house on Willow Lane. It was a summer night like so many others, but beneath the ordinary noises of cicadas and distant train horns, a different kind of tension pulsed inside Emily's home, a tension both familiar and terrifying. Emily sat at the edge of her bed, legs curled to her chest, staring hard at the faded constellations she'd stuck to her ceiling years ago. Down the hall, the muffled sound of her mother's voice rose, tired, pleading, before being cut short by the deeper, sharper tone of Frank. He'd been drinking again. She could always tell from the way his footsteps dragged and his voice turned thick and unpredictable. The laughter he'd shared earlier that night at the diner with neighbors had long since vanished, replaced by the brittle clatter of a bottle against the countertop. A sudden crash jolted Emily from her thoughts. She pressed her ear against her door, heart pounding. Frank's voice thundered, words harsh and slurred, accusations flying about wasted money and ungratefulness. Mary's responses grew quieter, edged with tears. The sharp sound of shattering glass rang out. A plate dashed against the kitchen tile, and then silence. Emily's hands shook as she gripped the doorknob, lit by fear and indecision. She knew better than to intervene directly. Frank's rage was a force that filled rooms and left bruises in its wake. But her mother's soft cry for help seeped through the cracks. Emily pressed her palms to her ears, trying to block it out, but the violence in the house found its way through the thin walls and deep into her bones. Minutes, or maybe hours, passed in a blur, time bending and warping with each fresh outburst. Shadows danced frantically along the corridor, the overhead, lights flickering with each angry movement. Emily sat frozen, every nerve on fire, hating her own helplessness. Her mind raced through scenarios, running for help, calling the police, finding somewhere to hide. But she was just a girl, her options swallowed by fear and the inertia of powerlessness. Finally, the storm reached its peak. Frank's shouts gave way to a horrifying thud. A chair toppled, and Mary's small whimper broke off into a frightening silence. For a moment, every sound in the house paused, a void where Emily could almost convince herself she'd imagined it all. But then she heard Mary struggling to stand, her breath ragged. Footsteps stomped away. A door slammed hard enough to rattle the windows. Emily ran out, nearly tripping over a fallen lamp in the hallway. She found her mother collapsed against the base of the kitchen counter. Mary's face was streaked with blood and tears. A violet bruise already blossomed across her cheek, her arms bent awkwardly around her. Emily fell to her knees, clumsy and desperate, cradling her mother as best she could. Mary's eyes fluttered open. She tried to smile for Emily's sake, even as pain clouded her features. A frantic series of hours followed that seemed to exist outside normal time. Neighbors said nothing. The phone sat silent, ignored, as if no one wanted to acknowledge what had happened. Frank disappeared into the night, leaving behind the mess and Mary's broken sobs. Emily dabbed at her mother's wounds and rocked her softly. In Mary's voice, whispered, fragile, Emily heard both apology and warning. "Don't ever let him hurt you, baby. Promise me." In the days that followed, the house was quiet in a new, alarming way. Mary rarely left her room. Emily, scarcely 14, found herself managing the household, tending to her mother's injuries and navigating a world that suddenly felt sharper, crueler. The outside world continued with its usual rhythms, school bells, mill whistles, neighbors' idle gossip, while inside, Emily felt the walls of their home closing in. Frank returned after 2 days as if nothing had happened. He offered no apology, only a cold glance in Emily's direction and a litany of excuses for Mary. He expected normalcy. The world demanded its routine be restored. But Emily saw her mother's spirit growing quieter, her light dimming. The person she'd once known as gentle and strong was fading beneath the weight of trauma. That night planted seeds in Emily's heart. seeds of rage and sorrow, but also resolve. As she lay awake, staring at the patterns of moonlight on her ceiling, Emily made herself a promise. She would carry the pain, the shame, the helplessness, but she would also remember every detail. Someday, she vowed with silent intensity, she would make Frank answer for what he'd done. She would find a way, no matter how long it took, to bring justice for her mother. Outside, the town of Maplewood slumbered on, oblivious to the storm that had just erupted behind the white picket fence on Willow Lane. For Emily, childhood ended that night, and something new, and far more dangerous, began to take root. Stolen childhood. In the months following that dreadful night, childhood slipped quietly away from Emily, replaced by something colder and sharp-edged. Gone were the easy days of after-school games and careless laughter. Instead, Emily lived in the shadowy hush of their home, where silence pressed down with the weight of things left unsaid. At school, Emily became a ghost in the hallways. Never invisible, but never truly seen for who she was. Whispers followed her between classes, fueled by small-town gossip and the strange, swirling rumors that always seemed to cling to tragedy. Some children avoided her altogether, as if whatever darkness had crept into her life might be contagious. Others watched her with a kind of wary fascination, waiting for her to crack or confess. Teachers, kind in their own way, offered guarded sympathy, but never questioned why letters sometimes went unsigned by her mother, or why Emily's homework began arriving crumpled and late. Home life had transformed utterly. Mary retreated inward, her movement slow and distant, as if every step required deliberate effort. She stopped gardening and cooking the special Sunday breakfasts that Emily loved. Emily took on these tasks herself, learning to flip pancakes and tend to the unruly flower beds so the neighbors wouldn't stare. She balanced checkbooks, made grocery lists, and figured out how to stretch a paycheck by buying generic brands. No one had taught her these things, but necessity became her sternest teacher. Frank's presence at home grew sparser and more unpredictable. When he was there, the household mood shifted, tense, brittle, with everyone careful to make themselves small and unnoticeable. Alice learned to move without making noise, her senses finely tuned to every creak in the hallway or the sound of keys in the door. She avoided his eyes and perfected a bland, polite smile that betrayed nothing. She began to wonder about escape, but the notion felt childish compared to the bitter reality of her days. With no siblings and her mother locked in her own pain, Emily's world shrank to a small, controlled orbit. Yet in this loss, something fierce took root inside her. She read voraciously, anything from crime novels to psychology textbooks borrowed quietly from the library. While her classmates obsessed over fashion and prom, Emily devoured stories of investigation and power. She studied patterns. She trained her memory to record details, facial expressions, inconsistencies in stories, the smell of Frank's cologne at odd hours. Every small suspicion was filed away in an invisible ledger she kept in her mind. Though she moved quietly, Emily observed everything. She overheard Frank's phone calls through cracked doors, picking out names of strangers and hints of deals gone wrong. She memorized license plates that appeared late at night in their driveway and watched as new faces, nervous, rushed, slipped in and out of Frank's orbit. Sometimes he came home with pocket stuff brimming with cash or with bruised knuckles he refused to explain. Maplewood's streets offered little respite. In their working-class neighborhood, suspicion and hardship were constant companions. Some neighbors gossiped, speculating about Mary's bad luck or the source of Frank's off-the-books income. Others simply looked away, deciding not to get involved. Emily learned that adults, who so often talked about right and wrong, were experts at seeing only what they wanted to see. The accumulating sense of stigma was suffocating. Friends' invitations dried up. Playdates became awkward. A few, like shy Ben from next door, offered clumsy words of support, but even he faded as Emily changed. She carried herself with a new, wary gravity, her childhood innocence carefully walled off. Yet beneath the surface, her rage burned steady and focused. She kept notebooks filled with secret observations, dates, names, oddities at home and at Frank's workplace. She saved receipts and recorded conversations on an old cassette player when no one was looking. Over time, tactics replaced tears. Emily's relationship with her mother became paradoxical, both closer and farther apart. There were nights when Mary, in rare lucid moments, reached for her daughter, apologizing in fragments for mistakes she couldn't name. Emily acted as nurse, confidant, and silent guardian, her young hands tending wounds, both new and old. But each apology felt like a brick added to the wall of sadness separating them. Emily's longing for the mother she'd known slowly turned into a fierce determination to protect what little remained. On the surface, nothing seemed to change. Emily went to school, shopped for groceries, smiled politely at adults. But underneath, she became something new, resourceful, wary, and driven by a purpose beyond her years. The plan that would one day bring Frank down was not yet fully formed, but each day layered another stone in its foundation. It was a lonely path, but Emily didn't allow herself to feel lonely. Loneliness was a distraction. Survival depended on vigilance. By the end of that bitter year, whatever childish dreams Emily might have had were swept away for good. She no longer hoped for rescue or miracles. Instead, she trusted her own cunning, the sharpness of her eyes, and the depth of her silence. Childhood, for Emily, was over. But something far more dangerous and strong was quietly awakening in its place. The first clues, Emily's world had narrowed to one razor-sharp point, uncovering the truth about Frank. In the years since her childhood was stolen, she had quietly honed herself, her mind, her instincts, her endurance, for this very purpose. Now, in the gray, uncertain space between adolescence and adulthood, Emily no longer just endured. She hunted. The transition was subtle, marked by routines her neighbors wouldn't have noticed. The way she stayed late at the public library, sifting through old newspapers and public records, the notebook always tucked beneath her arm, filling up with names, dates, snippets of overheard conversation. If Maplewood had ever bothered to pay attention, someone might have seen the steel in her eyes, the silent promise that secrets wouldn't stay buried forever. Frank had grown only more careful with time. After Mary's spirit faded and her body followed, a loss that left a cavity in Emily's chest she never truly filled, he buried himself in business, expanding his web of side jobs and under-the-table dealings. On the surface, Frank was the same dependable townsperson, shaking hands at the union meeting, calling in favors at the barbershop, bragging about his latest investment over breakfast at the diner. But the after-hours phone calls grew more frequent, and the men who visited the house after dark no longer bothered with small talk. Emily, meanwhile, became a shadow, quietly observant, expertly forgettable. She'd learned not to flinch under Frank's gaze, to smile when appropriate, to keep her tone neutral and her steps light. Years of self-preservation had fine-tuned her intuition. She could sense a lie or a change in mood before a word was spoken. But most of all, she was relentless. It started, fittingly, in the archives of the Maplewood Library, beneath the flickering fluorescence, and the ever-present scent of dust and old bindings. She began searching for anything that connected Frank to the spikes of criminal activity that sometimes rippled through town, the burglaries that went unsolved, the fires that started in disused warehouses, the sudden disappearances of certain day laborers. She read court records, scanned police reports, and, when the librarian's back was turned, snapped pictures of documents with a borrowed cell phone. What she saw were patterns, names that recurred, businesses that folded quickly after a visit from Frank or one of his associates, sudden windfalls that coincided with misfortune elsewhere in Maplewood. Her next step was bolder. By the time she was old enough to look the part, Emily decided to get closer to Frank's world. She took a part-time job at the local auto shop, where Frank was a silent partner. It was a place where deals were made, rumors traded, and tempers flared behind closed office doors. The manager, a rough-edged man named Kenny, was loyal to Frank but careless with paperwork. Emily volunteered for the evening shift when the day's business was tallied. She scanned the payroll records, noticing names that were paid in cash yet never set foot in the shop. She found inventory lists that didn't match what actually sat on the shelves. More than once, she caught a glimpse of Kenny slipping envelopes into the glove box of Frank's battered Ford Taurus. Emily listened, rarely spoke, and never questioned the right people directly. She picked up on the pecking order of Maplewood's back rooms. Who owed money, who'd walked out bleeding after a disagreement, who had suddenly paid off an overdue mortgage. She started to mark down connections, businesses, families, even the names of police officers who looked the other way. Her notebooks multiplied, coded so only she could decipher them. She kept one key notebook hidden away in a locked compartment beneath a false floorboard in her closet. Her own private archive of everything Frank had ever tried to hide. The more Emily learned, the more reckless she became. At night, she shadowed Frank's movements when he believed her asleep. More than once, she trailed his car in the dark, keeping 3 blocks back, ducking behind hedges when he stopped to confer with a stranger. She took down license plates, described faces in her notebook, even risked snapping a blurry photo from her battered smartphone. But gathering evidence was only half the battle. Learning how to use it meant understanding Maplewood's unwritten rules. She reached out, cautiously at first, to people on the fringes of Frank's world. The widow of a mill worker who'd lost his pension in one of Frank's failed ventures. The checkout lady at the grocery store, who jokingly asked if Frank could help her out the next time bills came due. A bartender downtown, willing to trade stories for the price of a strong drink. Emily was never overt, always framing her curiosity as idle conversation. But over time, trust, or at least sympathy, grew. People liked to talk if you listened without judgment. One night, a frightened man in work boots pounded on the back door after midnight. Emily recognized him as one of Frank's subcontractors, a man with broken teeth and downcast eyes. He thrust an envelope at her. "He said I could trust you," the man whispered. "You know what he's doing, don't you?" Inside the envelope were copies of receipts and ledgers, proof of embezzlement and threats, the kind of documentation that could ruin a reputation or start an investigation. Emily promised to keep the man's name private, and for the first time, she felt the path ahead begin to clear. Frank had always counted on fear and silence to protect himself, but fear had started to fracture. Emily's hardest task was hiding her actions from Frank himself. Increased absences and late returns prompted questions she deflected with well-practiced lies about work and school. If he ever suspected, he never let it show. But Emily did not allow herself to grow careless. There were days she came home to find her room subtly disturbed. Her pillow moved, the bottom drawer half open, a shirt missing from the closet. Each time, she swept for listening devices or hidden cameras but found nothing. It was a cat-and-mouse game, and Emily refused to blink first. As her evidence grew, so did her understanding of Frank. She realized his power was rooted not just in money or connections, but in a kind of confidence. The knowledge that nobody would dare challenge him, that Maplewood's best defense was minding your own business. But Emily wasn't afraid of being seen as a troublemaker anymore. She couldn't be, not when so much depended on her willingness to be, at last, the one person who refused to keep quiet. It was during one of her trips to the old mill, a place most kids now avoided, haunted by stories of accidents and ghosts, that she found the final piece to pull it all together. In an abandoned office, buried beneath a collapsed shelf, was a battered lockbox covered in dust. The keyhole was rusted, but Emily's nimble fingers and a borrowed bobby pin persuaded it open. Inside, she found evidence: signatures, pay stubs, contracts linking Frank to not only petty crimes, but orchestrated theft, intimidation, and cover-up stretching back years. Here was proof no one could ignore. Emily felt a tremor of fear and exhilaration. Frank's empire was built on bluster and threat, but now she had the means to dismantle it, piece by piece, lie by lie. She knew it wouldn't be enough to simply hand it all to the police or the press. Frank would fight back, possibly destroy anyone standing in his way. But the balance of power had shifted, and for the first time since childhood, Emily felt hope spark in her chest. The first clues were in hand, and Emily, hardened by loss and sharpened by survival, was ready for the coming storm. Striking back. The first clues were no longer just fragments in Emily's secret notebooks. They had taken on the weight of real leverage, dangerous but necessary. The night she opened the rusted lockbox at the abandoned mill became a pivot point. Emily's world, once shaped by waiting and watching, was now defined by action. For every silent wound she'd endured, every humiliation inflicted by Frank in their private halls, the time for quiet endurance had ended. She started slow. Emily understood that taking down someone as entrenched as Frank could not be accomplished in a single glaring move. It would require patience, cunning, and a calculated approach that allowed her to stay shadows ahead of both Frank's suspicions and the town's gossip-hungry eyes. Her first actions targeted the fragile seams of Frank's business empire. She began by slipping anonymous tips to the local paper's grizzled reporter, the sort of man who'd learned that every small-town scandal, sooner or later, led back to money and secrets. In careful, typewritten notes, Emily provided just enough evidence for a reporter to question. Unregistered payroll, mysteriously missing inventory, bank transfers that didn't add up. The little things worked first. A brief mention in a Sunday column about irregularities at the Maplewood auto shop stirred questions among shop employees and set the rumor mill spinning. Kenny, the surly manager, began checking locks and whispering angrily on his cell phone late at night. One accountant left town overnight. Emily watched from a shadowed bus stop as Frank showed up that Monday morning, face rigid, barking orders and demanding explanations. She could see the cracks forming, hairline fissures she would widen with every move. Next, she quietly approached Marjorie, a middle-aged bookkeeper recently let go from one of Frank's small companies, a woman harried by debt and disappointment. Emily didn't reveal her connection to Frank, instead posing as a concerned citizen. She asked about late payments, odd cash withdrawals, paychecks signed by names she'd seen in the lockbox files. Marjorie, desperate for some sense of justice and a friendly ear, remembered details Emily needed: the color of envelopes stuffed with cash, certain men who only appeared at night, bookkeeping ledgers that always needed fixing. While one hand sowed seeds in Maplewood's whisper networks, the other bribed no one, just quietly courted the dissatisfied. At the barbershop, she let herself overhear and retold stories about Frank's recent windfalls, creating subtle doubt. At the grocery store, she offered to walk home with a cashier who'd recently been threatened over an accidental overcharge. Slowly, carefully, she helped create a narrative. Frank wasn't just a hard-working man with a temper. He was manipulative, maybe even dangerous. In a town where reputations determined destinies, reputational doubt was a toxin Emily deployed expertly. The real threats came at night. Emily took extra precautions, triple-checking her phone wasn't bugged, always glancing behind on her walk home. She swapped out her notebook's hiding spot 3 times in 3 weeks, never trusting Frank's apparent absence for comfort. One evening, as she left the library, she noticed Frank's blue Taurus parked a block away. Engine off, windshield dark. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't change her gait. Instead, she ducked into the public restroom at the park and waited out the hour, forcing herself to stay calm, silent, and untraceable. But her plan was not just about hiding. It was about disruption. Emily started sending fragments of evidence to agencies just outside Maplewood, aware that local police, many indebted to Frank or simply indifferent, would do little more than warn him. The state tax office received anonymized records of the auto shop's missing inventory and false payroll. A labor watchdog group got redacted statements tying Frank to illegal contract labor. Each tip was crafted to be enough to raise eyebrows, but not enough to reveal Emily's hand directly. She knew she needed to buy time. Perhaps most daringly, Emily began manipulating Frank's network from within. She forged a cautious alliance with Jasper, a low-level mechanic whose shaky hands and nervous glances betrayed knowledge of Frank's off-the-books deals. Emily shared just enough to gain his trust, promising protection if he would swap harmless inventory shipments with decoys, disrupting Frank's flow of supplies and straining his cash businesses. With every phone call Jasper made and every strange accident at the warehouse, Emily grew bolder, more assured that Frank's grip was weakening. Frank, for his part, became erratic. At home, he paced more and drank less, not out of discipline, but paranoia. The bills piled higher. The phone calls lengthened. Emily watched as he slammed shut windows, muttered about traitors and rats, and began interrogating Kenny, Marjorie, and Jasper with escalating intensity. At the dinner table, he would pause mid-bite, eyes scanning Emily with an expression that flickered between suspicion and resignation. She met his gaze, careful not to reveal anything but teenage indifference, a look she'd perfected after years of practice. Tensions bled into the community. Weekly union meetings, which Frank once dominated, grew rowdy. Rivals questioned missing pension funds. A quiet man named Lou asked about the warehouse fire 2 winters ago that Frank had always brushed off as bad luck. Emily, present but invisible at these meetings, listened as rumors snowballed into accusations. Now, it wasn't just her private vendetta. Others were picking up the scent, yet every step she took also raised the stakes. A stranger in a delivery van began lingering after dusk, scanning her house from afar. Emily's mother's oldest friend was cornered by a gruff man at the diner, warning her to mind her business. Emily knew the closer she got to toppling Frank, the more collateral danger she invited. She started making photocopies of her most explosive evidence, stashing them in safe deposit boxes under fake names, a backup should something happen to her. Through it all, Emily's resolve stayed ironclad. Every new crack in Frank's world sent a pulse of wary satisfaction through her. But the fear was never far behind. She had seen what Frank could do to those who stood in his way. The weapons he used weren't only fists or threats, but manipulating fear, leveraging secrets, and knowing exactly whom to pressure and when. As fall descended on Maplewood and the air grew sharp, Emily's campaign intensified. She leaked anonymous letters to the town council about Frank's shady contracts and organized a petition demanding scrutiny of his latest business deal. Old wounds in the community, once suppressed by habit or intimidation, began to surface as neighbors compared stories with new skepticism. The town's sleepiness was fading, replaced by restless whispers and watchful eyes. Frank was caught between defending himself and chasing shadows. For the first time, his absolute control over the town was in jeopardy. He started making mistakes, firing workers who knew too much, shredding documents too publicly, showing up at community meetings red-faced and desperate to silence dissent. He publicly blamed rivals for his misfortunes, but privately, his circle shrank. Emily's vengeance was not the firework of a single explosive confrontation, but a steady, relentless erosion. With each move, she stripped away another layer of Frank's protective armor, exposing the rotten foundation beneath his authority. It was dangerous, exhausting, and utterly consuming. But for Emily, it was proof she was no longer the powerless girl of Willow Lane. She was striking back, and in the newly crackling air of Maplewood, it seemed, for the first time, that the balance of power was beginning to shift. Family tragedy. Frank's grip on the family had always relied on silence, a silence thick as old dust in the corners of the house. But now, the quiet was broken. As Emily's campaign chipped away at his hold over Maplewood and the foundations of his empire began to crack, the fractures at home grew more dangerous and raw. Some nights were filled with tension so palpable that Emily felt it in her jaw and her chest, an ache that never left. Frank was no longer simply angry or unpredictable. He had become a man hunted, lashing out at shadows, his paranoia feeding on itself until it poisoned everything around him. It began with suspicion, subtle but unmistakable. He'd stand at the kitchen window longer than necessary, watching the neighborhood with narrowed eyes. When the mail arrived, he inspected it before letting anyone else near, turning over envelopes, holding them to the light, sometimes setting them aside in a locked drawer. Phone calls became more frequent, but always behind closed doors, his voice a muffled growl. He moved through the house like a thundercloud, and Emily learned to track his presence by listening for the sharp creak of the floorboards and the scraping of his boots on tile. What Frank never said out loud, but what Emily read in every clenched fist and suspicious glance, was this: he knew someone in the house was working against him. He wasn't sure who at first, but he was sure the betrayal was close. Emily, poised and quiet, gave him nothing but surface politeness, yet she could sense his growing certainty, the moments when his gaze lingered just a second too long on her, or when he dropped a vague threat into the mundane routine of setting the table. "Let's see who's really loyal in this family," he said once, eyeing both mother and daughter as if daring them to flinch. Mary, meanwhile, shrank even further into herself. The violence had left her trembling, her hands shaking as she tried to fold laundry or slice vegetables. She avoided Frank, avoided eye contact with everyone, her voice growing thinner every day. The gardens she once tended with pride wilted and brown. Mary's friends, once fixtures at the kitchen table, now visited only briefly, uneasy in the charged air of the house. Emily knew her mother blamed herself, apologizing in stuttering whispers on sleepless nights, pleading with Emily not to do anything foolish, not to make things worse. But Emily could not stop. The revelations of Frank's corruption had set off ripples beyond their doorstep. She was now trapped in a web of consequences, and so was her family. In town, neighbors who once gossiped in good humor now traded rumors with hungry intensity. Some thought Frank was the victim of jealous rivals. Others whispered about bad blood in the family. A few, more perceptive, started to put the pieces together. About Mary's quiet suffering, about Emily's recent changes, about the trouble gathering like a storm over Willow Lane. A dividing line formed among the townsfolk. Some pitied Mary and Emily. There were casseroles left on the porch, soft words at the church entrance, awkward questions about how things were going at home. Others turned cold or even hostile. Emily overheard snatches of conversation at the supermarket, words like ungrateful, troublemaker, and should have known better. She realized, with a kind of bitter clarity, how quickly the town that prided itself on minding its own business could turn judgmental when its peace was disturbed. Frank, sensing the loss of his authority both at work and at home, pushed harder. He became obsessed with rooting out the enemy in his own house. He started coming home at odd hours, hoping to catch someone in a lie or a secret phone call. Emily's safe spaces vanished. She found the drawers in her room rifled through, her notebooks disturbed, the lock she'd installed on her closet broken off completely one evening. Mary's phone disappeared for a week before being returned with a new passcode neither woman remembered setting. Meals became interrogations, Frank grilling each of them about errands, schedules, and even memories from years past, looking for inconsistencies. The psychological warfare was almost worse than the violence. Each moment was fraught with the risk of exposure. Emily learned to answer questions with one-word replies, to memorize every detail of her day in case Frank tried to trip her up. Mary, torn between loyalty, terror, and exhaustion, cycled between urging Emily to apologize and disappear, and between begging her to be careful, to never let Frank know the truth. Their once close bond had become a tangle of secrets, pain, and desperate love. Late at night, Emily would hear her mother weeping, the sound mingling with the wind through the open windows. Softer, but, in its way, even more shattering than Frank's rages. As weeks passed, Frank's paranoia grew more aggressive. He tried to force Emily into a confession, cornering her under the harsh light of the living room lamp. "Is this what you want? To watch everything I built destroyed? To see your mother suffer?" His voice rose from pleading to threat and back again. Emily stared straight ahead, refusing to give him her fear. She knew if she showed weakness now, he would seize on it, would double down, would never stop until she broke. Or worse. The tension hit a fever pitch when Frank, unable to find the answers he craved, took his suspicions public. He cornered Mary during a quick visit to the market, loudly accusing her of conspiring with their daughter, of turning the neighbors against him. The scene drew a crowd, and though most pretended to ignore it, the news spread quickly. Suddenly, the rumor mill was no longer limited to Emily's supposed misconduct, but painted Mary as a co-conspirator, complicit or willfully blind. Mary's health began to unravel. Panic attacks left her breathless. She stopped leaving the house entirely, except for brief, furtive trips to the doctor. Emily took on more and more of the household burden. Bills, groceries, comforting her mother after Frank's tirades left her sobbing into a kitchen towel. More than once, Emily wondered if Mary would survive the stress, and this fear, the fear of losing even the hollow shell of her mother, was almost enough to make her reconsider her crusade. But every glimpse of Frank's cruelty, every bruise, whispered to her that stopping now would mean defeat, not safety. Frank's desperation was visible just as Emily's resolve hardened. He lashed out at everyone, old friends, business partners, even strangers who looked at him the wrong way. Maplewood was no longer a haven of tradition and quiet routines. It was fractured, tense, and wary. Some whispered about calling the police, but most feared Frank's reputation too much to become involved. Inside the house, the tragedy deepened. The love that had once made them a family was replaced with cold necessity and the grim solidarity of those under siege. Emily comforted her mother with the side of herself that had learned not to flinch, not to beg, not to hope for miracles. Instead, she waited, gathering strength, certain the reckoning was near. Frank, for all his bluster, was losing ground. The family's tragedy, once silent and hidden, was now the open wound that Maplewood could no longer pretend not to see. For Emily, it was the crucible that would determine not just the fate of their home, but who she would ultimately become. The fire of justice. By the time the first frost edged the lawns of Maplewood, Emily knew the momentum could no longer be stopped. The secrets she had labored in shadows to gather. Years' worth of coded notebooks, snapshots of forged contracts, ledger pages smuggled from Frank's office, and a battered lockbox filled with incontrovertible proof, were finally ready to be wielded in the open. Beneath her calm exterior was a storm, a mixture of fear, hope, and trembling anticipation for the moment when truth would burn through the silence that had choked her family and town for so long. Emily had spent weeks preparing for the coming confrontation. Late at night, her bedroom desk had turned into a war room, covered with notes, labeled evidence, and a carefully drafted timeline of Frank's crimes: embezzlement, fraud, illegal labor deals, intimidation, and more. Every time she felt doubt claw at her resolve, she reread passages from her mother's journal. Fragile handwriting, describing lost hopes and the slow erasure of Mary's confidence at Frank's hands. Her sense of duty was sharpened further by the memory of Mary's pain. Justice, Emily decided, would not simply be a reckoning, but a reckoning in public. The first move was bold. Emily gathered a selection of the most damning documents, photocopying each set in triplicate, and mailed them anonymously to 3 destinations. The first went to the local newspaper, whose editor had long harbored suspicions about corruption but lacked specifics. The second packet landed on the desk of a regional investigative reporter known for exposing organized crime in forgotten corners of the state. The third, and most significant, went to the county sheriff's office, delivered anonymously but accompanied by a letter listing where to find even more evidence hidden throughout Maplewood. Within days, the effect was seismic. The local paper ran a front-page headline questioning the integrity of Frank's businesses, citing irrefutable documentation received from an anonymous source. Within hours, whispers in Maplewood's diner and grocery store grew into outrage. People remembered loans unpaid, threats whispered, relatives who had lost their jobs after refusing to cooperate with Frank. The regional newspaper, broader in reach, promised an upcoming exposé on small-town corruption and racketeering. Officials from outside the area suddenly appeared in Maplewood, their state vehicles drawing curious, suspicious stares. Emily watched it all unfold with a sense of terrifying exhilaration. Frank, accustomed to ruling by rumor and manipulation, was now thrust into the center of a storm. Attempts to brush off the allegations fell flat. Where before a sharp glance from Frank could quiet a room, now his presence turned heads in accusation, not deference. His oldest business partner was called in for questioning and emerged red-faced and silent, refusing to meet Frank's eyes. Shop employees and mill workers, all those who had been threatened or coerced, began to speak, emboldened by the knowledge that someone, somewhere, was backing them up. But the onset of justice was hardly smooth or safe. Frank's reaction was as swift as it was desperate. He rallied what supporters he had left, blaming outsiders for targeting a hard-working local family. He threatened lawsuits, accused the newspaper of libel, and stormed into the sheriff's office demanding investigations into his rivals. But it was all shadow play. Beneath his bluster, the old arrogance was gone. Emily noticed that he drank more and slept less, watching the night through slatted blinds, gun visibly holstered at his hip. The legal system, always slow to act, began churning. An investigator from the state attorney's office arrived quietly, meeting first with local law enforcement and then with town officials. Within a week, bank accounts associated with Frank's shell companies were flagged for review. Subpoenas went out to former employees. Audits began. Town council meetings, once sleepy and perfunctory, became battlegrounds of accusation and revelation as neighbors demanded transparency, new elections, safety from retaliation. Emily's own role, so long hidden, became perilous. Though she continued to operate in secrecy, more than once she sensed eyes following her through the grocery store or down the school hallway. Rumors circled about a mole inside Frank's home. Mary, still battered from years of fear, begged Emily to stop, to let authorities do their work, but Emily shook her head. She knew that if she retreated now, Frank might regain control, or worse, lash out with all his remaining rage. Careful as ever, she began checking in daily with her most trusted friends and allies, using code phrases and never taking the same route home twice. As the evidence kept mounting, Frank's facade truly started to collapse. Too many years' worth of secrets were now aired. The mill pensions vanished by mistake. The hush money payments, the bribes. Those who had once felt powerless realized they were not alone. Several former confidants of Frank, faced with potential charges, chose to cooperate with authorities. In return for their testimonies, they handed over even more records, ledgers with Frank's own handwriting, tape recordings made during heated arguments, stacks of falsified invoices. The portrait of Frank that emerged, as a manipulator, extortionist, and abuser, was impossible to refute. One bittersweet afternoon, police cars lined Willow Lane. Emily watched from the living room as Frank was cuffed and led away, his face hard as stone, shouting about conspiracies and vengeance. Neighbors stood silently in their doorways, watching the man who had defined the town's limits for so long stripped of his power. Some wept quietly. Others looked grimly satisfied. Mary stood beside Emily, clutching her daughter's hand, tears streaming down her face, not just from relief, but from the raw grief of everything their family had lost. But in the days and weeks that followed, the meaning of justice became less clear-cut. Emily found herself plunged into a kind of numb exhaustion. The press hounded her for comment. Friends and enemies both wanted to know the full story. While she was hailed as courageous by some, others treated her with suspicion or envy. Emily would sometimes wake in the night, heart pounding, dreaming not of police sirens but of Frank's shadow at the door. A reminder that the past's scars lingered even when the villain was finally gone. And yet, Maplewood was changing. For the first time in generations, people believed that speaking out could matter, that secrets could be brought to light and faced in daylight, not just whispered in kitchens behind drawn curtains. The fire Emily had set was not one of destruction, but of painful, necessary renewal. The path forward remained uncertain and full of aches, not least for Emily herself, but the stranglehold of silence and shame had, at long last, been broken. Justice in Maplewood looked nothing like triumph, but everything like hard-won freedom. And as autumn blazed into winter, Emily realized the fire she carried would keep burning, quietly, for the rest of her life, a beacon both for herself and for anyone else who had ever been forced to keep the unspeakable hidden. Collapse. Frank's arrest reverberated through Maplewood like an earthquake, though the real destruction unfolded slowly, one revelation at a time. It was as if the town's foundation, built on quiet complicity and the illusion of stability, finally crumbled beneath the weight of secrets unearthed. Where old alliances once shielded Frank, now only the cold, indifferent evidence of his guilt remained. His career, his reputation, and every self-important claim he once made were swept away in an unstoppable current of public scrutiny and private shame. The news spread with ferocious speed. Front-page headlines, whispered phone calls, hurried conversations at the grocery store and the church steps. Each day seemed to bring a new disclosure. Another fraudulent contract exposed, another former ally reluctantly testifying, another asset seized by authorities. The ripple effect was everywhere. Frank's business interests fell apart in spectacular fashion. The auto shop closed under audit, family-owned properties locked and shuttered, joint ventures dissolved by frightened partners desperate to distance themselves from scandal. Years of tight control slipped away all at once, everything collapsing in slow motion. His supporters, once so loud and insistent, either vanished or rushed to remake their loyalties. Some neighbors who had fawned over Frank at backyard barbecues now avoided his house entirely, crossing the street rather than risk being associated with disgrace. A few tried to argue his innocence, but their voices were drowned out by stories from former employees, battered spouses, and townspeople who had suffered in his shadow. As Frank languished behind bars awaiting trial, his downfall ceased to be a single shocking event. It became an ongoing unraveling, exposing not just his own misdeeds, but the denial that had allowed them to fester. Mary became, in a strange way, a symbol for many. For those who remembered the lively woman tending her garden behind the white picket fence, it was a relief to see her name finally cleared. The town's gossip bent overnight, softening with belated pity, neighbors dropping off casseroles with awkward apologies, old friends reaching out to offer comfort or help with errands. For others, Mary's suffering was a cautionary tale. At church, the pastor's sermons began to reference the importance of facing evil, of looking after one's own, of not ignoring the signs of violence right next door. Yet, even with vindication, Mary's recovery was slow and uneven. The ghosts of shame and fear clung to her in ways no formal apology could erase. Emily found herself the center of a different kind of storm. Her uneasy victory laced with bitterness, pride, and unspeakable grief. In the quiet aftermath, she wandered the battered, emptied house as if retracing the scene of a long battle. Police tape still fluttered on the back shed, drawers remained half-emptied from searches, and traces of Frank's overbearing presence lingered in every creaking floorboard and shadowed hallway. Now that there was no longer a threat to anticipate, Emily faced a hollowing emptiness she had not prepared for. She tried to summon triumph, but what came instead was exhaustion, a bone-deep fatigue that sleep could not touch. For so long, her purpose had been survival and resistance. Now, mere existence felt strange and weightless. Some days she busied herself with practical matters, arranging meetings with lawyers, cataloging the remnants of family finances, helping her mother piece together the stray threads of their daily life. Other days, grief swallowed her, and she found herself staring for hours at a dried bouquet her mother had once placed on the kitchen table, or the faded constellation stickers on her childhood ceiling. The townspeople's reactions were a confusing jumble. A few younger women approached Emily at school with shy admiration, asking how she had found the courage to stand against someone so powerful. Others, especially older residents, regarded her coolly, as if the destruction of Frank was a dangerous precedent, one that threatened the polite, numb order Maplewood had relied upon. To some, Emily was brave. To others, she was reckless, or even responsible for the mess that followed. A teacher tried to comfort her after class, saying, "You did what you had to." But Emily could see in her eyes that not everyone agreed. At home, Mary struggled with her own conflicting emotions. She suffered flashbacks and panic in the wake of sudden noises, but also moments of raw relief. Some evenings, she and Emily shared meals in silence, the television muting the heavy quiet, while other times, Mary broke down unexpectedly, apologizing over and over for all the ways she felt she'd failed as a mother. Emily hugged her mother with arms grown steadier, but she too was haunted by doubts. Had her campaign for justice cost them too much? Did it matter, now that the future that stretched ahead felt unfamiliar and full of broken places. And yet, the collapse also forced new reckonings, both within the house and across the town. The chain reaction Frank's arrest set off could not be contained. It demanded difficult questions. Maplewood's leaders were pressed to review police oversight. Community groups formed, determined to offer resources for victims who had been ignored before. There were heated debates at town hall about the need for better protection, for transparency, for change in the very definition of neighbor. Emily saw Ben, the shy boy from next door, return to her porch one afternoon, holding out a plate of cookies as a peace offering, his cheeks red. They talked about old days, but the conversation never lingered long on the subject of Frank. Ben seemed to want to forget. Emily knew she never could. Still, a tentative new friendship started to take root in the places where loss had left gaps. But for all the gestures of kindness, there remained undercurrents of resentment and suspicion. Some people avoided Emily and Mary at the grocery store or whispered about the costs of dragging family business into the open. "We never had trouble before," one woman murmured. Emily wanted to scream. That trouble had always been there, only now was it visible. Frank's trial loomed over the fall like an unfinished storm. Legal hearings dragged on, reporters lingered at the edge of Willow Lane, and lawyers' letters arrived with numbing regularity. Each day, Emily steeled herself for fresh revelations, old wounds reopened. Sometimes Mary wept over the headlines. Sometimes she simply turned the paper face down on the kitchen table. Emily jotted notes, tracking every development, but her anger was shifting, cooling into something more complicated, a deep reckoning with the cost of justice and the impossibility of true restoration. As the first snows of winter dusted Maplewood, it became clear that the collapse was not just Frank's alone. The entire town, and especially Emily's own heart, would have to rebuild from the rubble of everything that had been lost. And though victory had been won, Emily understood now that the collapse was not the end. It was the beginning of something else entirely. A slow, painful making of new meaning. Hard-won wisdom shimmering just beyond old scars. Change and renewal. Winter deepened in Maplewood. The old town transformed beneath a hush of snow and the slow thawing of secrets long hidden. For Emily, each morning was a test, a push against loss, uncertainty, and the lingering shadows that had shaped her path for years. The collapse of Frank's empire had shattered the world she knew, but rebuilding required more than removing a tyrant. It meant facing the reality of survival and what it meant to truly live beyond the past. Emily noticed the changes in herself first. Where once her energy had gone into anticipating dangers or plotting careful moves, now she found her mind slipping into daydreams, imagining futures in new cities, afternoons without fear, and evenings spent doing nothing more urgent than losing herself in a novel. Small things felt monumental. The taste of hot coffee shared quietly with her mother. A new notebook, purchased not for secrets, but for doodles and sketches. Laughter, hesitant and short-lived, but laughter nonetheless, when a joke on TV actually landed. Mary, in her own time, began to emerge from her shell of pain. Her recovery was halting and nonlinear. Some mornings she would be animated, humming as she made pancakes or dusted shelves. Other days she barely left her bedroom, suffocated by anxiety, startled by memories she couldn't control. But over time, mother and daughter learned the contours of each other's wounds. They grew gentler, trading apologies for simple presence, sitting side by side on the porch steps, watching snow drift against the fence, speaking less but listening more. Their home began to reflect the shift within. Emergency locks were replaced with ordinary latches. Mary returned to her garden, broken beds slowly coming alive with hardy winter greens and the promise of spring bulbs. Emily sorted through old family belongings, Some they gave away, some they burned in the fireplace in quiet ceremonies, releasing the weight of what couldn't be mended. The house filled with tentative new rituals, Sunday lunches that welcomed old friends willing to reach across the distance, phone calls to cousins they hadn't seen in years, moments of shared silence that felt restorative, not brittle. Outside their doors, Maplewood itself was changing. The town held a collective breath in the aftermath of scandal, but soon its people began to grope towards something different. The church organized support circles for women who'd experienced abuse. The local school counselor started a club for students navigating family turmoil. Old divisions lingered, but in the grocery store and at the post office, more neighbors offered the Mitchells, for Mary had quietly reclaimed her maiden name, a nod of respect, if not open friendship. Some whispered apologies for not having intervened. Others asked with genuine curiosity how they were coping, what help they might need. For Emily, peace was neither quick nor simple. The freedom she'd fought for came with its own unruly emotions. Guilt that she hadn't saved her mother sooner, regret for lost innocence, and an anger that sometimes flickered back to life on restless nights. At times, these feelings crashed together and left her feeling stranded between past and future. But she was learning to let herself feel them all, to write about them in poetry and journals, to speak about them in tentative conversations with Ben or a school counselor. More than anything, she realized, healing couldn't be forced. It could only be allowed, a little bit at a time. Ben's friendship, too, became a small point of warmth in Emily's life. Gone was the awkward boy next door. In his place stood someone who listened more than he spoke, who could make her laugh without expectation or pretense. They studied together, compared dreams about leaving Maplewood for college, and sometimes, on cold afternoons, walked the edges of the frozen pond behind their houses, reminiscing about the childhoods that now seemed impossibly distant. Ben never pressed Emily for details. In his company, she felt her identity slowly stretching beyond the girl who brought Frank Mitchell down. For Mary, the acts of changing and reclaiming continued. She joined a quilting group at church, volunteered at the library, and began seeing a therapist in a neighboring town. Hard, brave things that Emily admired. On bright mornings, Emily caught her mother singing as she watered the window plants, something she hadn't done since before Frank. On harder days, mother and daughter would drive out past the limits of town, rolling down the windows and letting in the cold, crisp air, speaking softly of the future and sometimes the past. One afternoon, Mary surprised Emily by pulling an old, battered box from the attic, the remains of her own childhood in Maplewood. Together, they sorted through the box, uncovering photos, recipes, and a few treasured letters from Mary's younger years. "We get to start over now," Mary said, her voice trembling between joy and grief. "It's allowed. You're allowed to dream, Emily." It was this permission, given and received, that marked a turning point. Emily began to think beyond Maplewood's limits. She researched colleges, considered social work, and imagined using her experience to help others trapped in silence and shame. The thought sparked a quiet determination. She would not let her life be defined by darkness, but by what she'd chosen to build in its wake. In the town, new conversations brewed about accountability and forgiveness, about how to keep watch for families in pain, about what real community requires of its members. There were arguments, setbacks, and moments of tension, but also glimpses of genuine progress. A fundraising drive for the shelter, a teacher leading a seminar on trauma awareness, the library hosting talks on resilience and hope. As spring arrived, the world outside their windows brightened. Crocuses bloomed in the patch of earth Mary had once abandoned, a symbol of rebirth as clear as any Emily could imagine. They threw open the windows, letting out the stale echoes of accusations and fear. Breathing in the scent of new grass, wet earth, and all that was possible. The journey of change and renewal was far from finished. Emily and Mary's scars would never fully fade, and the town's capacity for ignorance or cruelty would not dissolve overnight. But each step forward was a victory, not just over Frank, but over the inertia and despair that abuse and secrecy foster. Together, mother and daughter learned that justice was not a final destination, but a path walked daily, with courage, with hope, and with compassion for themselves and each other. As the school year ended and the air filled with the promise of summer, Emily stood once more at her childhood window. Older, now wiser, and no longer ruled by vengeance. The pain of the past had shaped her, but it would not have the final word. In its place blossomed something powerful and fragile. The certainty that no matter how battered, new life would always find a way to root and grow. Closing the circle. Spring arrived in Maplewood with a softness and brilliance that Emily had never noticed before. Where the old town had felt suffocating during her adolescence, now each sunrise seemed to carry an invitation to notice, to remember, to move forward. Daffodils splashed the Mitchell yard with color, and the air hummed with the anticipation of a new season. It was the perfect time, Emily thought, to look back one last time before letting herself truly step into the future. Graduation was near. As the class valedictorian, Emily was expected to deliver a speech. For weeks, she struggled with it, writing versions that ranged from cynical to sentimental, drafts full of lines that felt too heavy or too hollow. But every page seemed to spiral back to the same questions she'd been asking herself since the night everything changed. How do you forgive what happened to you? And how do you start again without forgetting? Is it possible to honor the pain and the growth without being ruled by anger or fear? Emily spent long afternoons walking the familiar streets. She drifted past the white picket fence that her mother, Mary, had so carefully mended after every hard winter. She lingered at the gate to her old elementary school, remembering games of tag and the cloud of not knowing when she would one day transform from carefree girl to hunted survivor. She visited the abandoned mill, now locked and silent, its red brick still looming but stripped of the power it once had to shadow her home. Inside, the house had changed too. Where tension and dread once thickened the air, now there was quiet comfort. Mary's garden flourished, filling the kitchen with herbs and blooms. Their living room, once a fortress or battlefield, was lighter. There were more pictures on the walls, more books on the coffee table, fewer secrets. Mary herself was changed. Her laughter deeper, her sadness softer, her presence a steady anchor. Sometimes their conversations were full of memory and gentle humor. Sometimes they just sat together, sipping tea, understanding without needing to explain. In the town, the ripples of Frank's downfall continued to fade, becoming memory rather than open wound. Maplewood was no utopia, but it was different. At the market, people who used to gossip or avert their eyes now offered nods or cautious smiles. There were still those who clung to the old ways of silence and suspicion, but more often Emily sensed an atmosphere of gentle inquiry, as if the town was learning, slowly, imperfectly, to care for its own. When news from Frank's trial reached the paper, it was met not with shock, but with a kind of weary acceptance. The past, finally, had been reckoned with out loud. Ben, who had become Emily's closest confidant, encouraged her to see the world beyond the town's borders. Together, they would wander down to the edge of the pond and daydream about universities, summer road trips, or causes they might join. It took time for Emily to trust that she could shape her life around things she wanted, not just things she had to survive. He taught her how to sit with happiness without apology and to imagine herself as the hero of her own story, one who wasn't defined by struggle, but by resilience and vision. As May turned to June, Emily decided it was finally time to visit her father's grave, a quiet place she had avoided for years. Standing beneath the budding maple trees, she spoke aloud, not just to the father she barely remembered, but to the girl she used to be. She told them about her mother's courage and about the anger and fear she had carried like a second skin. She admitted her own mistakes, moments of cruelty, times she withdrew behind walls of silence, things she longed to change but could only accept. Forgiveness, she realized, was not an act done once, but a choice made again and again. It was the decision to soften, to understand, to care for wounds rather than letting them become weapons against herself. Emily chose to forgive herself, and she chose to let the cycle of pain and vengeance end with her. That afternoon brought no thunderous revelations, only the slow blooming of relief, a loosening, a readiness to step forward. Back home, Emily brought out the quilt her mother had been making over the winter. Each patch told a story: old clothes, scraps from Mary's wedding dress, a remnant of Emily's childhood curtains, even a bit of fabric from Frank's discarded flannel. It was not a perfect thing, some edges crooked, some seams puckered, but it was honest, made by hands that had suffered, survived, and healed. Laying it gently over the freshly made guest bed, Emily saw in it her own journey, a life not easily mended, but made worthwhile through patience and care. The night before graduation, mother and daughter sat under the stars on their back porch. Mary, tired but smiling, turned to Emily with tears shining in her eyes. "You're free now, sweetheart. You can go anywhere, be anything. Just remember, all that happened to you doesn't have to decide what you become." Emily hugged her tightly, letting the words settle deep inside. For so long, her story had felt like a closed loop, a trap set by another's violence and the world's silence. Now, that circle was loosened, not erased, but transformed. Memory would always be there, but it would not be her only companion. She could write her next chapters in her own ink. On graduation day, as she stepped to the podium in front of her classmates and neighbors, Emily didn't mention Frank by name. She didn't speak of revenge or suffering, but of hope and what it means to endure. "We are more than what happens to us," she said simply. "We can choose kindness even after cruelty. We can build even from ruin. We are never alone, no matter what's been hidden or lost." The applause was steady, and as Emily looked out at the crowd, at Mary, at Ben, at old friends reconciled, and new faces earned through struggle, she knew that the circle was truly closing. Not in defeat, but in acceptance. Her life was hers again. That summer, as she packed for college and helped her mother plant another row of flowers, Emily finally felt it. The past as something finished, not a shadow, but a ring of memory holding wisdom. Not pain. In its center was space for dreaming, powerful, gentle, and wholly her own. And so the story closed, not with bitterness or regret, but with forgiveness, courage, and the guiding certainty that even the deepest wounds can be healed, and every circle, once faced, can be opened to the light.